So once in a while, I see this discourse between Filipinos and Filipino Americans on my For You page. I think the most recent one I saw was between Bretman Rock and Vanessa Hudgens. The issue was her being, I think the issue was first her being a tourism ambassador in the Philippines, which she stepped down from that role. And then it just kind of blew up from there. But I want to focus on why this happens, and I want to focus on maybe 5 different phrases or topics, misconceptions that I hear all the time between two groups, but mostly this will be misconceptions I hear from Filipino Americans. So let's pull up our trusty Google Doc. And for part 1, the most common misconception I hear is that we're all the same. And yes and no, but really no, right? We have what, like 110 ethno-linguistic groups. So that means we speak between 120 to 170 languages in the country. So this would look like, someone who lives in Manila, where they live in an urbanized community. They focus more on this corporate grind. Manila is mostly known for traffic and that they're deeply individualistic, which is understandable because they live in a city. Or you see someone who is from the islands, or in the Visayas region. More specifically, here we'll use Romblon as an example, where they focus mostly on fishing, agriculture, and community. And because everything is so close-knit, their cultural norms are more pronounced. And then we have the indigenous group, the Indo people, or IPs, who was commonly known are living in the mountains on high regions of the Philippines. We have the Ifugaos in the Cordilleras. They are more sustainable. They have a better connection to the nature around them. And I see them really romanticized online, especially the Aitas, because, people think that they're Black people. Actually, let me show you this video.
These are the indigenous Black people of the Philippines. They're called the Isis, and I was invited to hang out with a community just outside of Manila. Their ancestors were the first people to arrive on the islands 40,000 years ago. My friend Lynn invited me to her.
Okay, so basically this is just another video of another foreigner going to these indigenous groups' areas, filming them. The caption is always like, the Black people of the Philippines, which is incorrect. And according to Coleriero, they said that despite the significant contribution to the country's heritage, so indigenous groups, and ecological balance, these communities often face marginalization and discrimination. They're among the poorest sectors of the population. They're illiterate, most vulnerable to extreme weathers, and have limited access to basic services. So when I see videos of people going to these communities, and like even the video I just showed you, Lizzo commented on it. Like, let me hear the comments. Love this, Lizzo. And yes, we don't call them Black. So all this means that we're not a monolith. There isn't a singular image of what a Filipino is or should be. I mean, we even have Kyle from Becoming Filipino, who is Canadian born and moved to the Philippines several years ago, who I think last year got his Filipino citizenship. And that made everybody happy because he is a good representation of what being Filipino is. And Filipino Americans try to define this Filipino-ness as like because they base it off common traditions that they think represents everybody. And it feels like a complete erasure of this really intricate and diverse culture, and it flattens identity and into this singular superficial blanket. And this whole statement really misses the point, and it misses the richness and also the struggles that these people face every day. Like, for example, I saw this video, and I won't post it here, but I saw this video maybe last year of somebody going to the Visayas area in Siquijor and in Cebu, where they dressed in traditional Filipino clothing. I think they specified what specific group that was, but the comments and the caption was something along the lines of Filipinos misunderstanding their origins. And the comments was like, oh, like they were looking at me funny because Filipinos don't understand their culture. But if you look on Facebook, when all the Filipinos were living there was talking about that, they were looking at you because it's so hot outside and you're wearing cloth that isn't for the beach and frankly isn't for the Philippines. And also, those specific garments are used for special events, and wearing that and making profit off of it online feels like it's just cherry picking what you think Filipinos are. And that's also another thing where the issue sometimes becomes Filipino Americans have this generalization and they think that this is what Filipinos are. And when Filipinos try to correct them, their entitlement shows up and they say, oh, they just plainly silence them. And it keeps going back and forth. Like, there is this really good video, and this is like a 50-part video of everybody.
Basically, she's the fil-am who talk very wrongly about our language. And before I get into her video, the thing about Filipinos is that we live internationally. But in that same breath, we hate being misrepresented. And I think this, and along with the Vanessa Hudgens things, is a prime example of that. And in the start of her video, she says, just because we're all Filipinos, it doesn't mean we all love and support one another. And for me, you would actually know that if you lived in the Philippines. Like, we are the 5th racist country in the world for 2023. And the running joke is that it's towards each other. So she goes on to correct herself in that video and then talks about how shaming is deeply rooted in Filipino culture. And you know what? I agree. Filipinos are quite vicious and there's really something that we need to change. But I think where the problem really lies is there's actually a huge difference between fil-ams and Filipinos. And to me, I think there's a possibility that they could actually be entirely separate from one another. Because we can't, relate to fil-ams. For example, let's bring back, the Philippine X debate. There were people that were saying the reason why there's Philippine X is because the LGBT doesn't feel included in that. But that begs the question, why do they not feel included? Because our lived Filipino experience as a Filipino living in the Philippines is that we are included. But if you live in the States, you are told to believe and you feel that you aren't, because we are living totally different experiences. So this person's impression of what being a Filipino is all actually just being a fil-am or whatever scholars have written. But the experience of being a Filipino in the Philippines is quite different. And that's something you can only ever really truly understand if you go to the Philippines.
So and all of this leads me to my next point, where Filipino Americans feel that it is cool or trendy to be in touch with your culture or your origin. They think that because they're part of that group, they should be the ones representing it, or they have an accurate idea of what that is, especially with, now we have the rise of you met me at a very Chinese era of my life. But let's put romanticization and almost cherry picking of the culture. I see this with food, especially about the misconceptions that Filipino food is unhealthy, but if you go to the Philippines, we do have a lot of dishes that cater to a vegan diet. And, you know, it's easy to do all of that. It's easy to try, and maybe that's one way they feel that they connect with their culture is through all of these stereotypes. But I found this quote by Edgar R. Ellis where he says, "The duality of identity, exploring post-colonial paradoxes and cultural oxymorons in the Philippines, to just cherry pick the cool parts without acknowledging the sacrifice, the systematic issues, the ongoing fight for survival and identity can feel dismissive." And I put this here at the end. And I hope you take this the wrong way. A Filipino American or a Filipino foreigner who is not born in the Philippines and goes there with the intention of exploiting the culture, so going to these IP groups, putting a camera on their faces like this, or going to the islands and uplifting these stereotypes, it doesn't make you any different to Vitali, who went to the Philippines with this exact same purpose. It's almost like you're seeing yourself as one and Filipinos as the other. And because of that, it rubs Filipinos who are living there the wrong way. We don't just see this internationally, we also see this at home, where you see Vogue Philippines not paying their creatives correctly. You see Manila clothing brands just trying to be wigger maxing or trying to make a profit off of what they think Filipino Americans or what they think this like cultural zeitgeist demands of them. I also noticed this with that hair tie debate issue where I forgot the creator's name, but I'll put it here, where she was selling $80 hair ties, and it was all for being Filipino, being all of this, without it being easily accessible for Filipinos. Because if you go to the Philippines and you buy a hair tie, it's under $1. And I understand that it's very important to try to get in touch with your origin and your culture, but that also should have a level of nuance and understanding of why you're willing to do that. Are you doing that because it's trendy? Are you doing that because your white boyfriend or black boyfriend or whatever is fetishizing it? And you think that commenting Oxford study on someone's page when they're with a white boyfriend does something, also that study never existed? Or you're doing this for profit? That should be one of the things that you should understand. And again, when, you know, Filipino Americans are corrected, when they're held accountable, they have the privilege to just be like, well, you know, like all hands up. And this does not lead me to part 3, but part 3 was another misconception I hear, which is that religion sets us back. I understand the colonialization of the Spanish had a lot of influence of how our religion and our beliefs and our systems are influenced. But when I hear Filipino Americans making that point, they don't understand that, you know, when the Spanish came, when Catholicism specifically came, it didn't erase our beliefs that already existed. It fused it. So we have this version of folk Catholicism where, yes, we go to church, we do all of the things that normal Catholics, Roman Catholics do, but we have, you know, when you go to an area where you feel like with trees or any land and you feel that it's spiritual, you say tabi, or in Tagalog, tabi tabi po. we still have a culture where we respect our elders. That's why in Tagalog you mano po, or you bless. And there are still cultures in the Philippines and groups that have anting-anting in their house, who, and I know this personally in Bisaya, where if you buy a house, you do an offering to that land. So whether that's, killing a chicken or killing a goat and spreading their blood right across, and it creates like this line. I think that this conversation about religion, and I won't go more into it, I can and I will, but not on this video, is just an easy excuse for people to say, oh, because of this is why we function this way, when really this conversation needs more nuance, and because it's complex. It's not because we're not like this because of Catholicism. We're like this because of the systems that still exist today, and blaming it on one specific thing, and especially blaming it on oppressors, is frankly such an American thing to do, and a Filipino American thing to do, because if you're in the Philippines, if you live there, that's not how they view religion. They view religion as a really good way to get in touch with their spirituality. It's a really good way for them to show respect to their elders and everyone around them. It creates this basis of virtues and values that every society needs. And as a Filipino American, that might be lost because you might not have a proper understanding of your virtues and your values, and you're expecting a group of people, the other side of the world, to do it for you. And I hope you keep that in mind next time you talk about religion, because it's not just a blanket statement. And for this, topic and this conversation to evolve beyond Filipino versus American, it has to come again with a level of nuance. And the fourth part I see is somewhat in connection to what I already mentioned about, foreigners or Blasians in the country who feel a connection to the Aitas, the other darker skinned groups in the Philippines, which is this like issue of blackness, and also this issue of not wanting tan skin. I don't really know what the title is. Tan skin. So, okay, there is, if you're a Filipino, right? Let me just, for Filipinos out there, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but Filipino Americans have this complicated racial landscape in the US where they are mistaken by or commonly grouped into other racial ethnicities. So you're African American, Black, or Latino. And the issue here isn't that they want to be Black, it's more because of the fact that they have shared experience. They experience racial profiling and marginalization. And where is that quote? Found here. Let's highlight. Theories of racial liminality and racial hierarchy suggest that Filipino students' interpersonal racialized experiences will differ from those of white and Asian students, while being more similar to those of Black and Latinx students. This makes sense to be connected to the Latinx community, mostly because, and the ongoing riff online is that like we're cousins, even though we're not, but because we have the same colonizer. And that's one part of why, Filipino Americans might feel a connection to the Latinx community. Another for Blackness, again, like I mentioned, is this issue of racial profiling, and that they understand the hardships of what Black people in America experience today. But this, on an individual structure, you could kind of connect this to like romanticizing who you are because you think you are part of this one group only. And I felt like combining these two felt appropriate because of the fact that Filipinos in the Philippines are penalized in their own communities, but it's radicalized and almost admired in the West. And sometimes it's misread as black altogether in America. And it's similar to tan skin in the Philippines, where it's heavily romanticized, but it's not respected. You are praised if you look exotic, if you're an island girl, if you're morena but you're still pretty, but it's heavily rejected if you're too dark, you're too masculine, you're too indigenous. Even I hear this all the time, where it's Filipino Americans trying to ring the bell that it's due to colonialism why we have this hierarchy when it comes to skin color in general. But I would like to point out that existed before colonialism. I found this really, really good video. I'm gonna pull it up here.
Island Steph. Why do skin whitening products sell so well in the Philippines? This is so interesting. A lot of people point out that our obsession with skin whitening is actually because of colonial mentality. Remember Doña Victorina in the Noli Me Tangere? She powders her face so that it becomes so white so that she can pretend to be a Spaniard. Well, you also remember here how Filipinos actually want to dress up like Americans and how they want to dress up like Koreans, for example. Now, colonial mentality perhaps heightened that kind of obsession with whitening. But if you're going to look at it, it's actually even before colonialism that being white is actually considered as beautiful. Professor Vicente Villan once said to me that in the epics of the Visayas, they gave high premium to binukot who are white. They didn't let their skin be exposed to the sun because they want to maintain their whiteness. And there are epics where it was said that the princesses, the binukots, who are desired by the datus, are actually as sing puti ng sugpo, balanakon. So we actually felt even before that having light skin is actually special. And you know, the Spaniards actually wrote in their chronicles that many of the women in the Philippines at that time were even whiter than the women in Spain. So that means considering white skin as beautiful is not just because of foreign influences, but it has deep rootedness in our ancient culture. We might find the clue in a study that was taken by the students of Palawan under Dr. Michael Tan. In their study, they found out that a lot of the consumers of skin whitening were actually construction workers. That's why, construction workers, them, they are exposed under the sun, they are like tall, dark, and handsome, and all of that. But actually, these people wanted to appear clean, especially if they are courting someone. They wanted to be presentable. So that is why a lot of people use skin whitening in the Philippines.
Because cleanliness on the outside can signal a clean heart within.
But most of this, I feel, in the grand scheme of things, is really dangerous when we romanticize Filipinos and thinking that they all should be dark skinned. And quiz, are you really Filipino if you know this girl? So I think she's called Balance Girl in Siargao. And she's so quirky and you can't take her anywhere. She just balances whatever she finds on her head, like beer, red horse, whatever. And I saw a video yesterday where she's on the famous bridge in Siargao and she's on the skateboard and she has really, really dark skin because she lives in the sun. And that's normalized in Siargao and other islands because that's okay. That's their version of beauty. I find it really sad because it seems like she's like a caricature where she knows that foreigners like and prefer dark-skinned women and because she's an islander. All this becomes really dangerous, especially for women, because if you're brown or tan skin, this almost becomes a symbol and people no longer look at you as a person. So when you have tan skin or black adjacent, if you have tan skin or black adjacent aesthetics, it's edgy, sometimes it's hypersexual, it's, you know, it's erotic, you're wild, you're free. But in the Philippines, these women become sexualized, but they're not at all protected by their own community or by those who come into the country. So when you have lighter skin, it becomes associated with class and your purity and that you are a good candidate for marriage. But if you have darker skin, you are associated with, you know, labor and sexuality and availability most of all. So I don't feel that the argument I don't feel that the argument should be, you know, colorism and preferring Eurocentric features in the Philippines is the biggest issue, especially when you see in the media, which is somewhat of a misalignment, a misagreement for Filipinos, because if you do go into not mass media in the Philippines, if you support local news, if you support local radio stations and local publications in your own island, you do see your own skin color, your characteristics being represented well. And I hope that we keep this in mind and that we don't generalize, because yes, the argument is always that when we go online or we go to Filipino mass media, as a Filipino American, that's the only thing available for you. Maybe that's the only thing you know. Maybe that's the only thing that you feel is the only thing available to you to get in touch with your culture, but that is not the case. And for the last misconception that I hear is that fil-ams speak for us, but they don't even understand what's going on here. So I think for Filipino Americans, they might define their identity by the American lifestyle. So that's material goods, technology, and this curiosity to explore their American, Asian American, Filipino American heritage and their identity by blending both cultures. For them, their biggest struggle might be this identity crisis. For Filipinos born in the country, the biggest aspect of their identity might be the value of their family and family relationships. It might be being polite and hospitable to others and having faith in God. So when I hear Filipino Americans say that we need to unlearn and decolonize, it feels like a privileged request from a distance, because in the Philippines, these colonial systems and their effects are still present and it's their active reality. And again, I'm not saying that Filipino Americans don't struggle. They struggle deeply, but the nature of that struggle is different. And sometimes, you know, the noise of Filipino Americans, because they have the privilege to speak freely online and freely with their communities, they drown out the actual voices and the immediate needs of those in the Philippines, in the homeland. I mean, these are just mostly what I hear every day. And I'm sure there's a lot more, but these are usually what I wanted to focus on today. And so where do we go from here? When I think about this topic, I don't necessarily think that this has anything to do with identity. I think of this more in class, like This reminds me of Noli when Doña Victoria and Capitan Tiago were social climbers, or did everything to erase their heritage in the name of, maybe it's for money, it's for their self-interest, for survival. And we see this in the long history of the Philippines, where we see Filipinos betraying each other. I mean, look at what's happening in politics today. It's clear that the people, the elites, don't care about everyday people living. And so when I have that in the back of my mind and I think about this topic, I view it as like, I don't know how to draw a pyramid. If there was a pyramid here, it would be Filipino Americans who are privileged enough to have the resources and the means to be able to dig deep and really understand their history, even after it's been erased or it wasn't celebrated at home or in their communities. In another part, I see Filipinos who are privileged enough to also go online and share their thoughts of what this is. Both are in a level of privilege fighting each other, and it erases all the other struggles that are going on in the Philippines. I understand that there is power, and even having just a little bit of courage to understand where you come from feels empowering, but at the same time it should come with this idea that as a Filipino American, almost demanding that Filipinos affirm and reassure you that this is what Filipinos are, is where you get it wrong. Like I said, there isn't a singular image of what a Filipino is. I think that's what makes this country so beautiful, with its diversity when it comes to religion and cultures. And we should always keep that in mind when we talk about Philippines. And the first thing when we think about the country should not be just stereotypes that we see, or one thing that you saw over like a 2-week trip in the country, because that is not a proper representation of what the Filipino culture is all about. And so that means you should be listening to the Filipinos living there. And the more we argue back and forth on what is not, it hardens the line and it really doesn't push the needle. And being Filipino means continuously pushing the needle and understanding that, yes, maybe this is our culture now, but it is going on a different direction, and it is also up to you to understand that, while also remembering our history. Anyways, bye. Thank you for watching.